This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast, where I'm talking to Susan Young, author of the book Growing Beans. As I've looked further into a sustainable diet, into growing and storing crops, and also because I've been incorporating some weight training into my exercise routine, I've been looking at sources of protein, and beans just seem to tick every box, but I needed to know more. So Susan's book is exactly what I've been looking for because it covers growing, harvesting and storing beans, and it argues a very convincing case for a fact that many people the world over have known for centuries, that beans are good not only for you, but for the planet, because they're such a resilient, easy to grow, low carbon footprint crop. Susan begins by explaining why beans are such a super crop.
Well, I mean, the first key point is that beans have this ability to fix nitrogen, and that's a fairly well-known fact. But what I think isn't appreciated is quite how that process works. So they are able, via a bacteria, rhizobia, to fix nitrogen that's in the air and convert that into amino acids that then becomes the amino acid, the protein in the beans that we then eat. But what's, I think, often not appreciated is that it's not so much that the beans are leaving nitrogen behind in the soil. That's often what people think, that you should grow a green crop after beans because they're leaving nitrogen in the soil. They're actually, if you're harvesting the beans and eating the beans as plump, fully formed beans, as it were, then the plants pushed all the amino acids into the beans, and there's not a lot left behind in the roots. But what they are able to do, therefore, is to grow in soil which is low in nitrogen to start off with. So they're very good to follow a crop that needs nitrogen. So they're good to follow greens, and they don't need a lot of extra fertilizer or compost. So they're very light on the soil in that respect. And they also need less water than many crops. So that's one of the reasons why they're a very good crop to grow in terms of soil enrichment. The other thing, of course, is the whole argument about the way that we exploit the land to produce meat, and therefore protein that we obtain from meat requires a vast quantity of land to produce that 1 pound of meat in comparison, or 1 pound of protein, I should say, in comparison with the amount of land that's required to grow beans. So that they're so economical in terms of how much land they need to produce the same amount of protein. And obviously then there's the whole argument about the carbon emissions. So the carbon emissions from beans is minuscule, I mean almost nothing, whereas carbon emissions from producing meat-based protein is considerably higher. Don't ask me to quote the exact figures, they're in the book, but I can't remember them precisely. And anyway, I think lots and lots of estimates vary, so it's enough, I think, to say that the amount of carbon emissions from meat it's considerably higher than the carbon emissions from beans.
I have to say, the case you set out at the beginning in the book is so convincing. Why are we not growing more beans?
It just doesn't make it just doesn't make sense not to, for all those reasons, and for preserving biodiversity and all the other health related reasons that go hand in hand with the climate change arguments. And in the year that we've had the climate change conference and heard all those arguments about the need to reduce carbon emissions, it's just so important.
From my personal point of view, I do find the whole thing a little bit confusing in terms of varieties and different species. And I did wonder if maybe beans are a little bit misunderstood, whether there's a lack of information around them or knowledge. And I thought it'd be quite useful to just cover briefly what type of beans we usually grow in the UK.
Yes. Well, so most people are familiar with broad beans, and I don't actually talk about broad beans in the book. The book is about the family of beans, the Phaseolus vulgaris, which is a common bean, and Phaseolus coccineus, which is the runner bean. So most people are familiar with runner beans, and they're familiar with French beans. They're familiar with broad beans. Now, we eat broad beans at the shelling stage. We don't eat them to dry. We have a tradition in this country of eating French beans and runner beans at the green stage, which is where just to eat the pods, or mange tout, or the sort of green fine stage. We don't have a tradition of allowing the beans inside to swell, and then even to eat them at that swell when they're sort of at a stage called demi-sec, when they're just starting to dry, but they're very nice to pick fresh and eat as you would eat peas. And then we also don't have much of a tradition of allowing them to dry, or picking them and then drying them to store for later. And of course, because we've had a tradition of eating beans at the green stage, and a liking for runner beans to eat as long, green, thin runner beans, the varieties aren't available for beans that are going to be very good to eat as in the shelling, at the shelling stage, or to dry to eat later. And it's difficult. Most of the seed catalogues will only provide French beans to eat as the green stage, and similarly with runner beans. And in some seed catalogues in Europe, they make a quite clear distinction between French beans that are to eat green and beans to eat to dry, écossais, they say in French, to be dried. So there's a quite clear distinction between those two types of beans, as with runner beans, but we don't do that in English seed catalogues because we haven't had a tradition of it. So really, and there are some beans very conveniently that you can eat at the green stage, or you can eat at the demi-sec, or you can eat them fresh, or then at this very particular stage of demi-sec, when they're just going dry, just starting to turn. They're particularly nice at that stage. Or you can pick them and dry them and soak them obviously, and cook them from dry later. And most of the beans that I grow belong to the Phaseolus vulgaris family, so they're common beans, of which there are just thousands upon thousands of varieties. And then some of the beans are the Phaseolus coccineus variety, which is the runner bean family. And interestingly, in parts of Europe, they've grown varieties of Phaseolus coccineus to produce large beans, mostly white beans, in Eastern Europe. And those are the lovely Greek gigantes or gigantes beans, and also the Polish beans, big white beans, which are absolutely delicious. And the pods are short and stubby, quite unlike, in a way, the normal runner bean pods that we would think of.
So if I had some green beans that I bought for eating at the green stage, or indeed runner beans, would it matter if I then let them grow on and harvested them as beans?
It wouldn't matter, but they're not necessarily going to be very good it would depend completely on the variety. So they're not necessarily going to be very good to allow them to grow on to the seed stage, as it were, to allow them to plump up. Because for one thing, most of the modern varieties of French beans have been bred to be stringless green pods, and the beans form quite late, and the beans that form are as fine as they can possibly be. So they haven't been bred to produce large beans. So they might be all right. There are quite a few varieties which can serve dual purpose, but it's better to buy and to sow and to grow varieties that are intended to be eaten at the shelling or the drying stage. And the same with runner beans. You can grow runner beans on to be large and allow them to plump up and then eat them as at the bean stage, as it were. But you're going to get those really large, big, meaty beans if you grow the ones that have been intended to be grown to be eaten as beans.
So are there any that are unsuitable or even toxic that you wouldn't eat at the seed or bean stage?
Well, all beans, as a general rule of thumb, all beans need to be boiled up. All beans contain shouldn't be eaten raw. They contain a toxin that is I don't know quite what the process is to explain it, but I know that the toxin is, I don't think it's removed, but it's no longer toxic if you've boiled the beans. And that's certainly true of kidney beans and then cannellini beans, which are quite closely related to kidney beans. So I happen to not grow kidney beans because I don't like them very much. But I know that you do need to boil kidney beans, take particular care with kidney beans to be sure to boil them for a good 10 minutes, if not more. But as a rule of thumb, I always give beans a rolling boil for about 10 minutes just to be on the safe side. Particularly if I'm cooking them from the dry stage. But otherwise, no. I mean, I can't think of any other beans that wouldn't be safe to grow if you're diverting from the normal seed catalogue. If you're going off piste with it, I know. I mean, and I've bought some really. I mean, I've bought beans in markets. You know, whenever. I mean, when I wasn't quite so concerned about carbon footprint, I fortunate enough to be able to travel to lots of different places, and I've always made a beeline for the markets and bought beans to bring back and to see what I can grow. And I've eaten those beans, and I'm still here to tell the tale. So I don't think I've been poisoned by them. I mean, you have to prepare them properly because if you're not used to eating beans, of course, they can cause you discomfort if you're not used to digesting them. But it doesn't take very long to kind of acclimatize your digestive system to being able to digest beans because they're digested in the lower intestine through a bacterial process, and your body just needs to accumulate those bacteria in your lower intestine in order to digest beans. But of course, that's what makes them particularly good for you health-wise.
I'm assuming that if you wanted to harvest beans at that stage, you also need to either dry them on the plant or find a way of drying them once they're off. And it's interesting in your book, actually, because you mentioned that sometimes in the UK climate, it's difficult to get beans to dry to the point where they're dry enough to store. And I think I must be really lucky because I'm down on the south coast. And I've actually, because I'm a lazy gardener, left a lot of beans to go to seed. And I've actually managed to dry the pods on the plant and then harvest them, put them in a jar, and they've been absolutely fine. Fingers crossed. But I think maybe in other parts of the UK, it's not so straightforward.
No, and this is the challenge with beans in that they need a long growing period, particularly if you're going to grow climbing beans, which maybe will flower later and then produce their pods later. The advantage, of course, with climbing beans is that you get a bigger crop for the amount of space they take up in comparison with dwarf beans. But if you want to be sure of the beans plumping up in the pod and then starting to dry, it's best to grow dwarf beans, but you're not going to get quite the same crop for the amount of space that you're using. But that's the challenge for growing beans in the UK is to get the growing season in before the weather closes in the autumn. So that's why you have to start them off early and start them off inside, and then keep an eye on them when they're coming round to the cropping stage. And it's also, of course, depends a lot on the variety. So there are plenty of varieties from Northern Europe which do perfectly well in our climate and will come to will start to dry on the vine or dry on the plant. But I'm also interested in trying to grow beans from Spain and Italy and southern France, and they, as a general rule, seem to need a longer season. But what I mostly do is just keep an eye on the plants, and it's just a question of keeping an eye on them, picking what is starting to go dry if you want to dry them, and then bringing them in, either just putting them in baskets in the greenhouse where you think they're going to dry off, or bringing them indoors, depending on the time of the year and depending on the season. I mean, if they get very wet and soggy, maybe you need to just dry them off on a warm boiler or radiator or something, just to make sure they don't go soggy. So it takes a little bit of care to be able to harvest the beans if you want to dry them. You just need to be looking regularly and picking a few all the time. That's what I tend to do, putting them in baskets. On the other hand, dwarf beans, you can often, as you say, get them to, I don't know if it was dwarf beans or climbing beans that you managed to get to dry on the plant.
Climbing beans and runner beans.
Yeah. Well, they will do. I mean, I'm fairly far south too, but I'm further west in terms of rain. So my issue is always that the rains come in the autumn, and then, but it's air around the plants that's more problematic than the rain. So if you can keep the air circulating around the plants, it doesn't matter if it rains and they're starting to get wet into the autumn. So it's about keeping them clean. It could be worth picking the leaves off in order to allow the air to circulate around the pods. And I have had beans. I'm looking out of the window now because I'm looking at a bean frame that I know I have, where it frequently falls over, well, sort of leans dangerously to one side when it gets heavy with beans. It always does it. And then the beans hang free and they've got the air circulating, and they can be there until November even, that I'm still picking them. So it just depends on the weather. It depends what kind of autumn we have. It depends on the variety. It depends how early you started them, and it depends on lots of things. And it just takes a little bit of experience to get used to knowing when to harvest them.
Yeah, I think we still had some on there in November into December, just hanging there, brown pods full of beans, which was, a miracle really that no animals decided to eat them.
Yes, well, that's another issue. I mean, I have a lot of field mice because we have a field. We're surrounded by fields, and the field mice love the beans and will just come along and nibble them and make little stashes of them. They open the pods and take the beans away and make little stores for themselves, which is very nice for the mice, I'm sure, but not nice for me.
Talking about the winter, I could have kicked myself because I've just got around to clearing some of my veg beds, and I dug up a huge tuber of a runner bean, and I said to my colleague, look at that, I wonder if we could save that. And then in your book, I see that you can.
Yes, and we were in Guernsey late summer, September. We went for a week to Guernsey, and there's a Victorian garden in Guernsey, and I noticed that they'd cut their runner beans down and just left them as little stalks for that very purpose, to overwinter them. So yes, fussy. So the runner bean family are perennial, and they produce quite a fat tuber, and you can overwinter them. And I've done it a few times now. The other reason I do it is because they will cross-pollinate more than the vulgaris variety. Cochineas will cross-pollinate. So if I keep the plants, obviously then I don't have to worry about saving seed and sowing it when it may have cross-pollinated. And I tend to keep the Greek ones because those are the ones I love and grow every year. And I also keep the Polish ones. The Polish white beans, Handsome Johnny, or there's a Polish name, but I'm not going to try and pronounce it for you. But the Polish beans are a little bit smaller, but they're a little bit more prolific, I find, than the Greek ones. So they're worth growing because they're quite generous. So both those varieties I tend to overwinter. And you don't need to keep, I don't keep very many. I keep about half a dozen of each and just store them but just the same as you would with dahlia tubers, exactly the same. They're a bit sluggish to, I don't know, I keep them in the greenhouse. They're a bit sluggish to start in the spring. You know how you look at them and you think, are these really going to do something? And you've watered them and potted them up. But then they do, actually, and they produce quite a few vines. So each year they'll come bigger, which is the other advantage of doing it. So I think it's well worth doing it, but it depends how many bean plants you want to grow and how much greenhouse space you've got.
I'm definitely going to try it, if nothing else, because of the fact that I can.
Yes. Well, I think that's me too. I tried it a couple of years and it seemed so easy. So easy to do. It worked a treat. So I do it now. I've got two normal sized wooden boxes, like apple crates, with them all packed in. One is the Greek beans and the other is the Polish beans. And they'll come round again.
I mean, I was inspired after reading your book to order some unusual varieties, and I did go for the Greek gigantes, and I went for lots of ones that were very pretty. One I'm especially excited about is District Nurse.
Yes. Oh, yes. That's a very good one to go. I like that one. It's very robust. It'll crop early, and has the most beautiful coloured pods. They're really unusual. They're kind of pale green streaked with a sort of navy almost, quite striking.
I was also inspired by your pictures where you grow your beans with flowers that kind of match them. I do like a pretty veg garden. If somebody was starting out and experimenting with growing beans, what would be some of the easiest ones that you might recommend?
I'm not sure. I mean, they're all pretty easy, to be honest. I'm slightly struggling to think of what would be the easiest one to grow. They're all very obliging. I mean, beans are really very easy, and I guess I'm a slightly I'm not a lazy gardener, but I'm kind of slightly casual, I would say. So I don't like crops that need a lot of fussing over. So that's why I've been drawn to grow beans as well, because they're just so easy. But I think that you can't go wrong with borlotti, and I know lots of people are growing borlottis, although they can be a bit slow to crop and they don't crop that heavily. The District Nurse that you're growing is a very good one. I'd always go for the Greek beans, because the Greek gigantes, because the white beans are so versatile. There are some wonderful German ones. One I'm particularly fond of is called Schneekäppchen in German, but that means snow cap. And it's quite a big bean, and it's half kind of toffee coloured and half cream coloured. It's got like a little dollop of cream on top, like snow on a mountain. That's why it's called Schneekäppchen. And it doesn't grow too tall, so it flowers early and then it crops early. So some of the German ones, because they're growing them in the mountains in Austria and southern Germany, are particularly robust, and they don't grow too tall, and that means they then flower early and they crop early. So you can be sure of quite a good crop from them. And that's a very good bean. There's one from Croatia, which is my current favourite. I tend to have favourites at different times. So my current favourite is one from Croatia called Domaći kućak, that's how I would pronounce it, Domaći kućak. And I don't know how you would get that bean, though, having recommended it. The dwarf beans, I mean, the other thing is that there are a lot of Dutch beans, which are mostly dwarf beans, and they come from the north of Holland, Friesland, and there's been quite a movement in the Netherlands to rediscover the heritage beans and to grow them in special gardens where they're cultivating these heritage crops. And there are a lot of interesting, quite small Dutch beans on dwarf plants, and they also would be very useful to grow. And because they're grown in North Holland, obviously they're used to a cold, wet climate. The other one that's very good to grow is that French one called Coco de Paimpol or Pampol or something. Again, the pronunciation, you spell it Paimpol. And that's grown traditionally in Brittany. And that's also a dwarf bean, and it's quite it's a round white one that you pick at the demi-sec stage. So it's traditionally picked at the demi-sec stage. And then, of course, there would be the Tarbé bean, which is the traditional cassoulet bean from southwest France. And herbs, and I happen to know that you can get that from herbs and the herbery, beans and herbs. Or is it herbs and beans? The name might be the other way.
I'm from, and I can't think which way around it goes.
Yes, I know. Well, she has the most wonderful selection of beans, and the Tarbé bean that she supplies, I've always found that does very well. And that's a kind of medium-sized, sort of slightly cashew-shaped white bean. And the French beans are mostly white. The French didn't like, and traditionally they've grown a lot of white beans because they didn't like the look of black beans in dishes, because they used a lot of cream and milk, and the black would kind of seep into the milk, and they disliked the colour. So you find that a lot of the French beans are white, whereas the Spanish ones are wonderful, rich colours. And I mean, the other interesting thing is that I've got some old gardening books from the 1950s and 60s. I'm looking down at some of them, and you'll find the Dutch beans, the North Holland brown and Mexican black. You find those beans in these gardening books up to the 1950s and 60s. And there's one here called Vegetables for the Epicure, and it's those kinds of beans are in that book. And somehow they just said they were being grown up until and they've certainly grown during the war as part of the Dig for Victory campaign, included growing beans, and these Dutch beans and the Mexican blacks are being grown during the war. And somehow, they've just gone out of favour, I think. I think we just lost the tradition of growing them. And we don't have a strong tradition in this country of cooking beans. We don't have a culinary tradition of growing beans and cooking them. And so it's not a tradition that's been continued since the war.
And what if you had to pick just one to cook with?
I think my favourite is an Italian bean called Zolfino, or Zolfini if you want to say the plural. So a Zolfino bean, it's a little round Italian bean that is sort of slightly pale yellow, sulphury colour. And it grows on very straggly dwarf bushes. So some dwarf beans produce like a sort of 3-foot leader, which is a throwback to their climbing origins, because all beans originally were climbing. And these Zolfino beans are very straggly bushes and tend to produce this long, straggly leader. But it's a very nice bean. It's not very starchy, so it stays firm when you cook it. And it costs an enormous amount to buy from gourmet food sellers. So you can buy it from, I think Frenchie was selling it in their delicatessen range for sort of like £10 a bag. And I don't know where you can obtain the seed though. I mean, I've ended up having to buy a bag of beans from them and then sowing the beans, because of course if they're organically grown you can just sow them and they'll germinate, but I don't know where you'd get the beans. And I bought some from Italian seed sellers, but of course now we can't order from Europe. We're very restricted in what we can get, which is a real shame.
And how about your favourite way to eat them?
Well, to be perfectly honest, the more we cook beans to eat, the more simply we cook them. So we cook them with herbs and garlic and just eat them as they are. There are some wonderful, wonderful pulse cookery books coming out. There are lots of wonderful books with delicious recipes in them. But we've come to like beans more and more simply cooked. I suppose if you're asking for a favourite dish, though, it would have to be in a tomato sauce, either the Greek beans in tomato sauce or other beans in tomato sauce. And we make a tomato sauce. We puree tomatoes at the end of the summer that we grow, and then cook them in a fresh tomato sauce. And they're just wonderful like that, just delicious.
I hope you've been inspired to grow and eat more beans. If you have, please send me pictures of your plants and beans this summer, because I'm really feeling the love for beans. The seed company that Susan referenced in the interview is Beans and Herbs, and I've included a link to their website in the show notes. Thank you to Susan for talking to me about beans. Thank you to you for listening. And just before I sign off, I recently realised that I have an overzealous spam filter, and I discovered lots of really interesting emails in there, and I'm mortified at the thought that I've missed others. If you have emailed me, I will always reply, even if it takes me a good while. So if you've emailed in the past and thought I've ignored you, I haven't. I'm sorry, and do please reach out to me again. That's it from me. Have a great week. Now Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a global menace.
Precisely 30 years ago, the vast winter vegetable crops of California became headline news around the globe, since they'd rapidly succumbed to phenomenal infestations of tobacco whitefly, a sap-sucking insect that was assumed to be just a relatively minor pest within tropical and subtropical countries around the world. However, this 1 millimetre long, sap-sucking bug was so numerous in California that many trillions of them formed dense swirling fogs as they moved amongst the crops. This unprecedented event resulted in a catastrophic yield loss of around $500 million, but also presented a mystery as to why a previously insignificant insect should suddenly have become such an extraordinary crop pest. So entomologists throughout the world, including myself, were asked to investigate. We began by setting up international science networks, which then enabled the Californian whitefly to be studied and compared to tobacco whitefly populations from many other countries. And as the research was collated, it became clear that the Californian whitefly was very different to the others. It produced more eggs, transmitted many plant viruses, and most worryingly, was resistant to insecticides and highly prolificous. It was in fact a new superbug, a type of the tobacco whitefly that had rapidly evolved to survive the chemicals that were being extensively used within crop protection. As the research continued, diagnostic tests were developed that easily distinguished the superbug from other tobacco whitefly populations and enabled it to be tracked across the world, which soon revealed that the superbug had already spread to all continents and that it was linked to the global trade in ornamental plants, dispersing out from infested importations onto field and horticultural crops. Discovering this was a breakthrough, since it enabled the whitefly's migration routes to be intercepted. Then, by using integrated crop protection strategies instead of repetitive chemical treatments, the whitefly's insecticide resistance levels were reduced, and so its control within crops throughout the world became more manageable. Despite this, though, the superbug strain of the tobacco whitefly remains a serious plant pest and transmitter of crop viruses within warmer regions of the world, which includes southern Europe. And even here in the UK, it remains high on the national list of notifiable pests, and is one of the reasons why ornamental plants, such as imported poinsettias, continue to be checked at our borders.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.